The furnace kicked on at 5:47 in the morning, same as it always did when November settled into Ohio like a house guest who'd long overstayed their welcome. Margaret Eleanor Sullivan was already awake. She stood at the kitchen window with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Black, no sugar, the way Thomas had always made it, and the way she'd made it ever since. Because some habits are less about preference and more about holding on to something that used to be warm. Outside, the backyard was gray and still. The oak tree her husband had planted in 1986 stood bare against a sky the color of old pewter, its last leaves scattered across the frost-stiffened grass like a mess nobody had gotten around to cleaning up. She'd get to it. She always did. The rose bushes ran along the back fence in a long, quiet row, dormant now, cut back for winter, just sticks and thorns waiting for April to remind the world they were still alive. 6 of them, each one planted for a reason Margaret could recite in her sleep. The deep red one, closest to the fence post on the left, that was for the wedding. June 12, 1978. Thomas had shown up to the church with a small dirt smudge on his collar that nobody noticed except her, and she'd loved him for it in a way that surprised her, the way love sometimes does when it arrives not dressed up but just real. The white one, second from the left, Ryan's birth. August 12, 1975. 17 hours of labor that her own mother had called God's way of making sure you appreciate what you've got. Margaret had not found this funny at the time. She found it accurate now. The yellow one, third from the left, the day Thomas came home after his first heart surgery. She'd planted it the same afternoon he walked through the door while he was asleep on the couch, because she needed to do something with her hands before she fell apart. The other 3 she'd planted for smaller things, good years, anniversaries, a summer that had been particularly kind. Thomas had teased her about it. "You're going to run out of fence," he'd said. She'd told him they'd just have to build a longer one. He'd died in March of 2019. The fence stayed the same length. Margaret took a long sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in her chest. But this is not where the story begins. The story begins 8 months earlier on a gray March morning with a Bluetooth speaker and a conversation Margaret was never supposed to hear. To understand this November, why she was standing here in this kitchen with this coffee for the last time, you have to go back to March 14th. She was 72 years old, 5'4", and had been slowly losing ground on that measurement for about a decade. Her hair had gone fully silver sometime around her 65th birthday, and she'd decided, upon looking at it one morning in the bathroom mirror, that she liked it. She had the hands of someone who'd spent 30 years writing on blackboards and over 4 decades in a garden. Slightly rough, very capable. And she had eyes that were the particular shade of blue that younger people sometimes described as sharp, as if sharpness were something unexpected in someone her age. She noticed things. She always had. It was what had made her a good teacher. It was what had made her a good wife. It was, as she was about to discover, what was going to save her. She was not a woman given to self-pity. Her own mother, a woman from rural Kentucky who'd raised 5 children on a schoolteacher's salary and never once complained about it in mixed company, had raised her to believe that self-pity was an indulgence with no return on investment. "Feel bad for 5 minutes," her mother used to say, "then figure out what's next." Margaret had followed that advice through the crib death of a pregnancy between Ryan and Tyler that nobody except Thomas had known about. She'd followed it through Thomas's first cardiac episode at 51, through his second surgery at 60, through the slow, quiet diminishment of those last 2 years, when he'd been more tired than not, and the house had grown louder with everything neither of them was saying. She'd followed it on the morning she'd woken up next to a man who'd finally stopped breathing sometime in the night, and she'd lain still for 20 minutes before she called anyone, because she needed those 20 minutes to begin the enormous, terrible work of rearranging her life around an absence. She'd followed it after that, too. And yet, if you'd asked Margaret Sullivan in September of last year whether she trusted her son Ryan, she would have said yes. Complicated yes, but yes. Ryan was not a warm man. He hadn't been since sometime in his late 30s, when ambition had hardened around him the way it does when it goes unchecked for too long. But Margaret had raised him, and raising someone means knowing the soft places in them, even when they've learned to keep those soft places hidden. She knew the boy who'd cried for 2 days when their dog, Huckleberry, had died in 1991. She knew the 20-year-old who'd called her from his dorm room at Ohio State at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night to say, unprompted, "Mom, I just want you to know I know how hard you work for me. That boy was still in there somewhere. She just couldn't find him anymore. The oven timer she'd set for 6:15 went off, and Margaret crossed the kitchen to pull out the banana bread she'd made the night before. Force of habit. She'd baked every Sunday night since 1981 and saw no reason to stop now. She set it on the rack to cool, refilled her coffee, and stood again at the window. The story of this house, the real story, the one she'd never told anyone in full, had started before she and Thomas even moved in. 1978, the year they bought 1147 Elmwood Drive, Westerville, Ohio. The house had needed work. Thomas knew the electrical, Margaret knew the paint and the floors, and together they'd spent their first summer there with their sleeves rolled up and a radio playing Fleetwood Mac from a paint-spattered shelf. Thomas had cut himself badly on a piece of exposed copper wire on a Saturday morning in July, and Margaret had wrapped his hand in a dish towel and driven him to the ER and sat in that plastic chair for 3 hours thinking, "This is the man I get to do hard things with. I am very lucky." She still thought that. Present tense. 5 years after his death, she would think it when she drove past the old hardware store on Broad Street where they'd bought their first gallon of exterior paint. She would think it at the strange quiet of a Tuesday evening when there was no one to tell about her day. She would think it. She thought it now, standing in the kitchen they'd remodeled together in 1995, with a steadiness that had become one of the few things she absolutely relied on. The ache and the gratitude together, like the coffee. Black, no sugar. Honest. 1989. The first real test. Thomas was 51. The chest pains had started in August, and by October they had a diagnosis. Coronary artery disease, significant blockage, surgery recommended. The cost, after insurance, after everything, was going to land somewhere around $190,000 when it was all said and done. They had a savings account. They had equity in the house. They did not have $190,000. Margaret had a ring. It was not a flashy ring. It was a slim gold band, 18 karat, with a small diamond that Thomas had saved for, worked overtime for, driven an extra delivery route one summer for. Inside the band he'd had engraved, June 12th, 78, always. She'd worn it for 11 years. She took it off on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table, set it in a small velvet box, and drove it to the pawn shop on Cleveland Avenue before Thomas woke up. She got $340 for it. A drop in the bucket. But a drop that, together with other drops, their savings, a second mortgage, Thomas's sick leave payout, 3 years of Margaret's teacher salary going almost entirely toward medical debt, eventually became enough. Thomas found out about the ring 2 months later. He'd noticed its absence but hadn't said anything, the way he sometimes didn't say things when he was frightened of the answer. When she told him, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Margaret, I'm going to buy you another one." "Thomas," she'd said, "don't be ridiculous. You just had heart surgery." "I'm going to buy you another one," he said again. "When I can." He never did. Not because he forgot, but because life kept arriving with other needs and the ring kept getting bumped to next year and then the year after that. Margaret didn't mind. The ring had done what it was meant to do, and she had the marriage it had paid for, which seemed like the better end of the trade. 1994. Ryan's acceptance letter to Ohio State. The kitchen table. Margaret remembered the exact quality of light coming through the window. Late afternoon, early spring. The honeyed kind that made everything look like a memory while it was still happening. Ryan had run in from the mailbox holding the envelope like a relay baton. He'd torn it open right there, and when he read the first line his whole face had changed. Not just smiled, but opened, like a door swinging wide. Mom, I got in." She had held him, and over his shoulder she had caught Thomas's eye across the kitchen, and Thomas had looked at her the way he sometimes did when he needed to say something serious but didn't want to say it in front of Ryan, and she had given him the smallest shake of her head. Not now, not in front of him. Later, after Ryan had called 3 friends and retreated upstairs, she and Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the financial aid package spread between them. The numbers were not good. The gap was significant. Ohio State was the right school for Ryan. Margaret had no doubt about that, but getting him there was going to cost them the house. Not lose it, but use it. Another mortgage. Another borrowing against a future they'd have to earn their way into. Thomas had said, we could talk to him about in-state alternatives. Thomas, or a gap year to save up. Thomas. He'd stopped, looked at her. He's our son, she said. We don't find another way. We find a way. They'd signed the refinancing papers in April. Margaret had not told Ryan, then or ever. The choice to sacrifice something for someone you love isn't a debt you collect later. That was the whole point of it. When Margaret turned away from the kitchen window on that November morning, knowing it was among her last in this kitchen, in this house, she was not thinking about any of this history. She was thinking about the way Ryan had looked at the thermostat the last time he visited. A quick look, evaluative. The kind of look you give something you're already calculating the value of. She'd noticed it and cataloged it without comment, the way she used to catalog the small behavioral signals of students who were struggling with something they hadn't yet said out loud. She was thinking about Emily's voice the previous Christmas, bright and effortful, talking about senior communities in the area. Not that kind, Margaret. The nice ones. The ones with pools and yoga classes and, people your age. And the way the word management had appeared casually in at least 2 separate sentences about the house. She was thinking about the fact that her son had called her twice in October. Not to talk, really, but to ask each time whether she'd thought any more about your living situation. Margaret Sullivan had raised 2 boys and 30 years of other people's children. She knew the difference between someone checking in and someone checking the perimeter. She washed her coffee mug, dried it, set it back on the hook where it lived. Then she went to get dressed, because she had things to do. March 14th arrived gray and cold, the kind of Ohio morning that couldn't make up its mind whether to snow or just threaten to. Margaret was in the backyard at 7:30, kneeling at the base of the yellow rose bush with a pair of pruning shears and a thermos of coffee beside her on the ground, when she heard Ryan's car pull into the driveway. She frowned. It was a Tuesday. Ryan didn't do Tuesdays. Ryan did weekend visits, announced in advance, lasting between 90 minutes and 2 hours, during which he ate whatever she'd made, checked the smoke detectors, and asked questions about the house that were specifically about the house, and not somehow about her. Tuesdays were not part of the pattern. She stripped her gardening gloves off and went inside through the back door just as Ryan was letting himself in through the front with his key. "Hey, Mom." Big smile. Easy. Practiced. The smile he'd developed sometime in his mid-30s that she thought of as his professional smile, the one he used when he needed something from someone. "Wasn't sure you'd be up." "I've been up since 5:45, Ryan. I'm always up at 5:45. Right. He was already moving through the living room toward the hallway, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes doing that quick inventory sweep she'd been noticing for months. Walls, ceiling, floors, windows. Not the sweep of a son checking on his mother. The sweep of a man pricing square footage. "I wanted to check that thing in the basement. The water heater's been making noise, you said?" She had not said that. She had no memory of saying that. "I said the pipes knock sometimes when the heat first comes on in the morning," she said. "That's been happening since 1987. It's not the water heater. Still, better to take a look." Another smile. "You want me to make you some coffee first?" "I have coffee, thank you." He set his phone on the kitchen counter, face down, which was new. Ryan usually kept his phone in his hand like a compass he couldn't navigate without, and disappeared down the basement stairs. Margaret refilled her thermos from the carafe on the counter. Then she crossed to the small hallway desk, the one Ryan always used when he stayed over, the one positioned just beside the door to the living room. The top drawer was unlocked. She'd never needed to lock anything in her own home before. Inside, folded into a plain manila envelope, were papers she recognized the format of before she'd fully read them. She slid them out just far enough to see the header, set them back, took the envelope, placed it flat inside her gardening bag on the bench by the back door, beneath her gloves and her kneeling pad, where it sat quietly and waited. She was back at the kitchen counter pouring water into the kettle when the small Bluetooth speaker on the kitchen shelf, a birthday gift from Dot 2 years ago, used primarily for NPR in the mornings and Patsy Cline in the evenings, chirped softly. The small indicator light on its face turned blue. Connected. Margaret looked at the speaker, looked at Ryan's phone, face down on the counter. The screen showed a faint glow. Ryan's phone had connected automatically to the speaker, the same way it always did when he was in range. She remembered him playing music through it once, last Easter. The speaker remembered. Devices always remember. And now, somewhere in the basement below her feet, Ryan's phone was ringing. She could hear it through the floor. She could also hear it clearly through the speaker on the shelf. She heard Ryan answer, "Hey," his voice coming through the small speaker, slightly distorted by distance. She could picture him, standing near the water heater that didn't need checking, one hand on the cold metal of it for no reason, the way he stood when he was on the phone in tight spaces. "Did you bring the papers?" Emily, sharp and already impatient. "Not yet." A pause. "I need to find the right time." "Ryan, there's never a right time with these things. The Hendersons close in 6 weeks. We need the deed." Margaret set down the kettle, carefully, without making a sound. "She's going to ask questions." Ryan, a different register now. The voice Emily used when she was explaining something she'd already explained and was losing patience with explaining again. "She's 72. She gets confused. Just tell her it's something for the property tax update. Keep it simple." I don't know." "She won't even know the difference between a home and a care facility, Ryan." Flat, certain. The tone of someone who had considered the obstacle and found it manageable. "Not in a year or two. We've talked about this." A long pause, the kind that contains a whole argument that's already been had and lost. Ryan's voice, quieter now. "This is Mom's house. It's also $900,000. Emily's voice did not soften. "And our future. Or do you want to keep carrying 2 mortgages while she's sitting in a 4-bedroom house by herself?" Something crackled. Ryan moving. The connection thinned and the speaker's light clicked off. Disconnected. Margaret stood in her kitchen for an amount of time she couldn't have measured afterward. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed on Elmwood Drive with its radio on, briefly audible and then gone. The banana bread from last night was still on the counter, covered with a clean towel. She turned on the faucet and finished washing the cup she'd already washed. The water was cold before she remembered to switch it to warm. She won't even know the difference between a home and a care facility. Margaret turned off the water, dried her hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle, the one with the faded sunflower embroidery that Tyler had given her for Mother's Day back in 2003, still in use because she'd never seen a reason to retire something that still worked. She folded it neatly and hung it back. She sat down in Thomas's chair. Thomas's chair was technically just the chair at the head of the kitchen table, a plain wooden chair with a small cushion tied to the seat that Margaret had retied 3 times over the years as the strings wore out. Thomas had sat there for over 4 decades, for coffee and cereal, for bill paying, for the crossword puzzle he'd done every Sunday until the last year of his life, when his hands had gotten unsteady enough that the pen was more trouble than it was worth. She'd offered to read the clues while he just answered. They'd done it that way for the last 8 months of his life. She sat in his chair now, put both hands flat on the table. She won't even know the difference. Margaret thought about the ring she'd sold for $340. She thought about the refinancing paperwork she'd signed so Ryan could go to Ohio State. She thought about the summer she'd taught 3 sections of summer school on top of her regular job because Tyler had needed braces and Thomas had been between jobs for 4 months and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Not even Dot, because she was fine, and they were managing, and there was no reason to make it into a bigger thing than it was. She thought about Emily sitting at this exact table at Christmas, eating the pot roast, talking to Sophie about college applications, touching Margaret's arm and saying, "Margaret, you look wonderful, you really do." And Margaret had smiled and said thank you, and believed it, in the comfortable, habitual way of a woman who wanted to believe well of the people her children loved. For the first time since Thomas's funeral, Margaret Sullivan cried. Not the polite kind, the real kind, brief and involuntary, the kind that comes not from pain exactly, but from the sudden, undeniable understanding of how badly you have misjudged something. She allowed herself exactly 4 minutes. Then she heard Ryan's footsteps on the basement stairs, and she stood up, and she dried her face, and by the time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she was standing at the counter pouring the last of the coffee into his travel mug, which she'd retrieved from the cabinet where she kept it because he always forgot it. "Pipes look fine," he said, brushing dust from his jacket sleeve. "I know," she said. "They always do." She handed him the travel mug. "Drive safe, Ryan." She watched his car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window. She watched it until it turned off Elmwood and disappeared. Then she picked up her phone and called Dorothy Patterson. Dot Patterson lived 11 houses down on Elmwood Drive in a white Cape Cod with green shutters and a porch she'd never once allowed to go unswept. She was already at the door when Margaret came down the sidewalk, wearing her red wool coat, the manila envelope held flat against her side. "I was wondering when you were going to call," Dot said. "You sounded weird on the phone." "I sounded perfectly normal." "Maggie, I've known you since Carter was in office. You sounded weird." They sat at Dot's kitchen table, smaller than Margaret's, rooster-patterned placemats, a basket of apples in the center that Dot refilled every week from the farmer's market because she liked having them there even though she never actually ate them. And Margaret set the envelope on the table. "I found this in Ryan's desk drawer," she said, "while he was in the basement. Before you say anything—" "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were making a face." "I was just sitting here," Dot said, already reaching for the envelope. Dorothy Patterson had spent 25 years as a court clerk in Franklin County, which meant she had spent 25 years handling, organizing, filing, and occasionally untangling the legal paperwork of human beings at their most complicated. She could read a deed the way some people read a menu, quickly, with immediate understanding of what she was and wasn't looking at. She put on her reading glasses, slid the documents out, turned through the first page, the second, the third. She stopped. Margaret watched Dot's face do the thing it did when something wasn't right. Not alarm exactly, more like a particular quality of stillness, the way a doctor's expression shifts when they hear something through a stethoscope that changes the nature of the appointment. "Maggie, I know. This is a quitclaim deed." "I know what it is." Dot set the papers flat on the table. "This transfers the house, all of it, from you to Ryan and Emily." She looked up over her reading glasses. "Did you sign this?" "No." "Because there's a signature here on the grantor line." "It's not my signature, Dot." The two women looked at each other. 40 years. That was what sat in the space between them at that table. 40 years of shared history, of Thanksgivings with kids underfoot, of sitting in this same kitchen after Thomas's funeral eating store-bought lasagna because neither of them had the bandwidth to cook, and that had been absolutely the right call. "It's close," Dot said, looking at the signature again. "Whoever did this, they practiced." "Not well enough." "No." Dot pulled the page closer. "Not well enough." She set it down. "There's a notary stamp, Maggie. February 3rd. February 3rd. Margaret did the math without meaning to. 30 years in a classroom had made arithmetic reflexive. February 3rd was 6 weeks ago, 11 days after Christmas. 11 days after Ryan and Emily had brought Sophie over and they'd all had dinner together. Pot roast and mashed potatoes and the apple crisp recipe she still made every year, because it was genuinely the best she'd ever had. Sophie had sat beside her and asked her to teach her how to make gravy. "Grandma, I've tried like 4 times and it always comes out lumpy." And Margaret had laughed and said she'd show her properly next time. And Sophie had leaned her head briefly against Margaret's shoulder the way she'd done since she was 4 years old. Instinctive and easy. 11 days after that, someone, Ryan, or someone Ryan had paid, or someone Emily had arranged, had forged Margaret's signature on a legal document designed to remove her from the only home she'd lived in for over 4 decades, while she'd been thinking about lumpy gravy. "Maggie," Dot's voice, careful and even. "What do you want to do?" Margaret picked up the document, set it back in the envelope, smoothed it flat with one hand. "I want to make a phone call," she said. "Do you still have a good printer?" Dot took off her reading glasses. "Honey, I've got a printer, a scanner, a laminator, and 25 years of knowing exactly which county office opens at 8 a.m. Margaret looked at her oldest friend. "Good," she said. "Because I need to find a lawyer." James O'Brien's office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow brick building on Main Street in Westerville, sandwiched between a dental practice and a title company, which Margaret found either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you looked at it. The waiting room smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee and had 3 framed prints of Irish countryside on the wall that were either very good reproductions or very cheap originals. She didn't ask. She had found him at 2:14 in the morning, 3 nights after sitting at Dot's table with the forged deed between them. She'd been in bed, not sleeping, her phone screen the only light in the room, reading through attorney reviews on 3 different websites before landing on O'Brien's page. 41 reviews. Average 4.9 stars. One review, posted by someone named Patricia W., read simply, "He was honest when honest was hard to hear, and smart when smart actually mattered. Hire him." She called his office at 8:02 the next morning. He was a big man, not heavy, just large, the kind of man who fills a doorway without meaning to, with gray at his temples, and the particular weariness of someone who had heard too many versions of the same story without being surprised by any of them. He shook her hand across the desk, gestured to the chair across from him, and said, "Mrs. Sullivan, tell me what's going on." She told him. All of it, in order, without editorializing, because she'd been a teacher long enough to know that the clearest communication is always the one that gives you the facts and trusts the other person to feel appropriately about them. She spoke for 40 minutes. O'Brien took notes on a yellow legal pad, asked 4 questions, and did not interrupt otherwise. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the documents she'd laid on his desk. "Okay," he said. 3 things. The first thing was the window. The quitclaim deed, forged signature, fraudulent notarization and all, had not yet been filed with the Franklin County Recorder's Office. Until it was officially recorded there, it had no legal force whatsoever. The house was still entirely hers. "But," O'Brien said, and Margaret had already learned that his buts were the part to pay attention to, if Ryan files that deed, even with a forged signature, reversing it becomes a process. 6 months minimum. Could stretch to 18. Courts, depositions, expert witnesses on the handwriting. You'd win, almost certainly, but winning would cost you time, money, and significant stress. So what's the move? He looked at her steadily. You sell the house yourself, before they file. A cash sale, meaning the buyer pays the full amount up front, no bank financing involved, can close in 7 to 14 business days. Once the deed transfers to a legitimate buyer, the quitclaim deed is void and worthless. There's nothing left to contest. How fast can we move? If your buyer is ready and motivated, 12 days is doable. Then let's do 12, she said. The second thing was competency documentation. O'Brien brought it up himself, unprompted, and she appreciated that. In situations like this, he said carefully, where an older property owner makes a significant financial decision that surprises their adult children, the children sometimes respond by claiming the seller lacked mental capacity at the time of signing, that they weren't in their right mind. Margaret looked at him steadily. You're telling me my son might try to argue I was out of my mind when I sold the house he tried to steal from me? I'm telling you it happens. More than I'd like. Then we make sure it can't. She pulled a second envelope from her bag and slid it across the desk. O'Brien opened it. His expression did a small thing just around the eyes that wasn't quite surprise but was closely adjacent to it. Inside was a full cognitive competency assessment administered by Dr. Harriet Kim at Westerville Family Medicine. 6 weeks prior, paid out of pocket so no insurance record would appear. Score, 29 out of 30. No signs of cognitive decline. Memory, judgment, and decision-making all completely intact. Along with it was a small USB drive. O'Brien plugged it into his laptop. The video was 8 minutes long. Margaret watched herself on the screen, sitting straight in the examination room chair, hands folded in her lap, answering Dr. Kim's questions calmly and precisely. Date, year, president, home address, purpose of the visit, and then the part she'd asked Dr. Kim to include at the end. The camera steady. Margaret looking directly into it, no notes, no preparation. I am Margaret Eleanor Sullivan. I am 72 years old, and I am of sound mind and full legal capacity. I am selling my home at 1147 Elmwood Drive, Westerville, Ohio, of my own free will. I understand exactly what I am signing, and I would like the record to show that I understand it better than some people who will be very surprised very soon. O'Brien stopped the video. He was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Sullivan, he said finally, where did you learn to do that? For the first time in weeks, Margaret smiled. 30 years in a classroom, Mr. O'Brien. You learn to anticipate what comes next. The listing agreement was signed that Thursday. Carol Whitfield, a seasoned real estate agent who specialized in discreet, fast-moving transactions, came through the house that evening, quietly and professionally, made her notes, and had a verbal offer from a couple named Robert and Patricia Dunham by Saturday afternoon. $910,000, all cash, no contingencies, close in 12 days. Margaret accepted without counter-offering. She wasn't negotiating. She was moving, which meant it was time to deal with the house itself. She started in the basement on a Sunday morning, the way you always start with the hardest thing first when you've decided to stop putting it off. The basement of 1147 Elmwood Drive was organized the way a house looks when two practical people have lived in it for a long time. Not cluttered, but full, every shelf holding something that had been placed there deliberately. Over 4 decades of the accumulated physical evidence of a life. Thomas's workbench along the south wall, tools still in the arrangement he'd kept them, sockets graduated by size on a pegboard, level hanging from its hook, 2 hammers side by side. She didn't touch those yet. There was a box for Tyler, if he wanted them. If he didn't, she'd donate them to the vocational program at the high school where she used to teach. Thomas had hated things that went unused. The box she was looking for was on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. Brown cardboard, sealed with packing tape she'd applied herself, written in her own handwriting. T. Personal. She hadn't opened it since the week after the funeral. She brought it upstairs to the kitchen table, sat down with her coffee, opened it. The flannel shirt was on top. Blue and red plaid, Pendleton, bought at a department store in Columbus sometime in the early 90s. Thomas had worn it every Saturday he'd been in the yard, cutting grass, raking, crouching next to the rose bushes while Margaret showed him what needed doing, his big hands careful and slightly clumsy around anything that grew. She could smell him in it still, or she thought she could, which was either the same thing or better. She held it for a long time, not crying, just holding it. Then she folded it the way he'd always folded his shirts, thirds, not halves, because halves leave a crease down the middle, and set it in the Goodwill pile. Because Thomas had said it once, matter of fact, while they were cleaning out his own parents' house after his father passed. Things are just things, Maggie. Don't let things weigh you down when you could be moving forward. She'd thought he was wrong at the time. She thought he was right now. The kitchen door frame was harder. She stood in front of it for a long while before she could look at it properly. The pencil marks ran from about knee height up to a little past 5 feet. A vertical record in faint gray lines, each one labeled in her handwriting. A name, a date, a number. Ryan, 4 feet 11 inches, August 12th, 1985. He'd been so proud that year, convinced he was about to hit a growth spurt. He had, eventually. Tyler, 4 feet 3 inches, October 6th, 1984. Tyler had always been the smaller one. It hadn't slowed him down. Ryan, 5 feet 9 inches, August 12th, 1994. The last one she'd ever marked for him. The summer before Ohio State. He'd stood against the doorframe because she'd asked him to, rolling his eyes with the specific performative exasperation of a 17-year-old who still, secretly, loved this ritual. She touched that last mark with one finger. The woman next door, Linda, had offered to have the trim cut out and saved for her. A thoughtful gesture. Margaret had declined. Those marks were for the children I was raising, she thought. That chapter is closed. She was wrapping the last of the kitchen items in newspaper when her phone rang. Sophie. Hey, Grandma. Quiet. Careful. Hi, sweetheart. Margaret tucked the phone between her ear and shoulder and kept working. You okay? A pause. I need to tell you something, but you have to promise you won't say it was me. Margaret set down the mug she'd been wrapping. Go ahead. Last week I heard Mom and Dad talking, in the kitchen when they thought I was upstairs. Another pause, shorter, like she'd rehearsed up to this point and now had to improvise. They were talking about Elmwood, about how to move you out before things got, quote, complicated. Dad mentioned some place in Sunbury and Mom said something about the timeline and Her voice cracked slightly. I tried talking to Dad about it after. He just said adults handle adult things and that you needed care and Alfie. Gentle, clear. Hey, breathe. A shaky exhale. You did the right thing calling me, but I need you to do something else now. What? Don't say a word. Not to your dad, not to your mom. Act like this conversation didn't happen. Grandma, are you? I'm better than fine, Sophie. And she meant it, she realized, in a way she hadn't meant anything so simply in a long time. Trust me, okay? A beat. Okay. Good girl. I love you. I'll talk to you soon. She hung up, stood at the kitchen window one last moment, looking at the dormant rose bushes along the back fence. Then she picked up the newspaper and kept wrapping. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of stationery and the good pen, the one with the weight to it that made handwriting feel intentional, and she began a letter. She wrote it slowly, and she wrote it once, and she did not revise it. She signed it. Your mother, Margaret E. Sullivan. She added a postscript. She folded it, sealed it in a white envelope, wrote Ryan on the front in her clear, even teacher's hand. She set it on the kitchen table beside a small glass bud vase. She'd fill the vase in the morning, one red rose from the bush she'd planted for her wedding, something for the house. Not for Ryan, just for the house. Then she went upstairs, drew a bath, and slept better than she had in months. The closing was on a Wednesday. Carol Whitfield had arranged everything cleanly and efficiently, the way she did all things. O'Brien sat beside Margaret at the table. Robert Dunham, a quiet man with kind eyes who'd sold a small business he'd spent 20 years building, sat across from them with his wife Patricia, who had already asked Margaret twice if the rose bushes along the back fence would survive a transplant. Margaret had told her they were tougher than they looked, which was true of most things worth keeping. Margaret signed her name, her real name, her actual signature, formed over decades of report cards and birthday cards and checks and permission slips on every line that required it. Steadily, clearly, without hesitation. When it was done, Carol slid the keys across the table to the Dunhams. Margaret shook everyone's hand. She thanked O'Brien. She told Patricia that the yellow rose bush liked more water than the others and needed extra mulching before the first frost. Patricia wrote it down. Then Margaret walked out of the title company office on a cold April morning and sat in her car for 3 full minutes before she started it. She did not cry. She had already done that, in measured, appropriate amounts at the appropriate times. She had allocated her grief the way she'd always allocated difficult things. Honestly, without waste, without letting it run over into the time she needed for what came next. She started the car. She drove down Elmwood Drive on her way out of the neighborhood. She'd planned this, taking the long way around. She slowed when she passed 1147. The driveway was empty. The rose bushes along the back fence were just barely beginning to show the first pale suggestion of new growth at their tips. A thin thread of green, almost nothing, easy to miss. She saw it. She drove on. The morning of April 3rd was cold and bright, the kind of Ohio spring morning that looks like a promise until you step outside and realize the air still has teeth. Margaret was not at 1147 Elmwood Drive when Ryan's car turned onto the street at 9:44 a.m. She was 12 miles away, sitting at a corner table in a small cafe on High Street in Columbus's Short North neighborhood, drinking a cappuccino she'd ordered because she'd never allowed herself to order cappuccinos before. Thomas had been a black coffee man, and she'd spent over 4 decades matching his habit out of the comfortable laziness of long couplehood, and reading a novel she'd bought the previous afternoon from the used bookstore 2 doors down. She was on page 43. She intended to finish it by Thursday. Her phone was on the table, face up. She watched the minute hand on the cafe's wall clock with the same calibrated patience she'd once used to watch the classroom clock during state testing, when 30 children needed her to be completely still so they could be still too. Ryan parked in the driveway at 9:47. Emily was in the passenger seat. They had not called ahead. They never called ahead for Elmwood anymore, a habit that had settled into something that felt like ownership without technically being it. Emily had her tablet open, a browser showing 3 assisted living facilities near Sunbury. She'd already emailed one for a tour. Ryan took out his key, fitted into the deadbolt. It didn't turn. He tried again, the way you do when you assume the problem is user error. Slightly different pressure, slightly different angle. The lock didn't move. It wasn't stuck or stiff. It was simply a different lock, responding to a different key, belonging to a different chapter of the story than the one Ryan Sullivan thought he was still in. What the? He pulled the key out, looked at it, tried again. Emily got out of the car. What's going on? The key doesn't work. What do you mean the key doesn't work? I mean, Ryan said with the flatness of a man whose patience was thinning fast, that I put the key in the lock and the lock does not unlock. That's what I mean. Emily looked at the door, then at the windows, all the curtains drawn, which was wrong. Margaret kept the front curtains open during the day, said a house needed light the way a person needed air. The driveway was empty. The garage showed nothing. Emily tried the doorbell. They both listened to it echo inside the house. Nothing moved. She called Margaret's phone. 4 rings, voicemail. Called again, same result. Then Emily saw it. Taped to the inside of the narrow glass panel beside the front door, the side light Thomas had added in 1992 to let more sun into the entryway, was a white envelope, positioned precisely at eye level, facing outward. The name Ryan was written on it in a handwriting he had known his entire life. Ryan broke the sidelight glass with his elbow, reached in, retrieved the envelope. He opened it standing on the front porch of 1147 Elmwood Drive, his wife beside him, in the cold, bright April morning. He read it once quickly, and then once slowly. Emily read it over his shoulder. Margaret, who was not there, who was 12 miles away on page 47 of her novel, had nonetheless written it precisely, knowing it would be read this way, knowing Emily would be standing there, knowing the audience for every sentence. Ryan, by the time you read this, the house at 1147 Elmwood Drive will belong to Robert and Patricia Dunham. The sale closed yesterday. The keys have been transferred. The locks have been changed. I know about the quitclaim deed. I know about the forged signature. I know about the call you had with Emily, the one about the care facility, and the one about the $900,000, and the one about how I won't know the difference. I want you to know something, Ryan Daniel Sullivan. I have always known the difference. I do not write this letter in anger. I write it because I spent 30 years teaching children that actions have consequences, not as punishment, but as truth. You made choices. These are the consequences. The money from the sale is mine. I have plans for it. Good ones, the kind your father would have approved of. I am healthy. I am clear-minded. There is documentation to prove both, should you ever wish to argue otherwise. I will not be going to a care facility. I will not be coming back to Elmwood Drive. I am going to live. Your mother, Margaret E. Sullivan. P.S. The rose on the kitchen table is for the house, not for you, but if you ever find your way back to being the boy I raised, you know where to reach me. Emily read the last line, said nothing. She was smart enough, and she was genuinely smart, which was part of what made all of this what it was, to understand immediately that there was no angle here, no filing, no countermove, no legal clause to invoke. You cannot contest a completed cash sale to a third-party buyer. You cannot challenge the signature of a woman who has a notarized video of herself demonstrating full cognitive competency, calmly explaining every term of the agreement she was entering. You cannot undo a timeline that has already run its course. Margaret had not left them a door. Emily set the letter down, sat on the front step, the step of a house that now belonged to the Dunhams, who were at that moment in Columbus having no idea any of this was happening. She looked out at the street. Her tablet was still in her hand, the Sunbury facility still on screen, and she looked at it now as if she'd forgotten what it was for. Ryan stayed standing, staring at the door. She can't do this, he said, low, a little hoarse. She did it, Emily said, and something in how she said it, stripped of the certainty that usually held her voice up, the certainty that had been the architecture of this entire plan, told Ryan that she already knew what came next. Nothing good. At 2:34 in the afternoon, while Ryan was still on the phone trying to reach O'Brien's office, a call that was not going to change anything, but that he needed to make so he could feel like he was doing something. His cell phone showed an incoming call from his bank. He answered it on the second ring. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Emily watched his face through all 6 of them. She had been in commercial real estate long enough to read a deal going bad in real time, and she watched it happen now in the slow, incremental flattening of her husband's expression, the small erasures, one by one, of every contingency they'd built their plan around. The house they'd put an offer on in Upper Arlington, 4 bedrooms, good school district, the kind of address that meant something in Columbus, had required a deposit. $45,000. Non-refundable under the contract terms they'd signed if the buyer failed to complete the purchase due to financing issues on their side. They'd put it down without hesitation, certain the Elmwood money was coming. Their entire forward motion had been financed on that certainty. The Elmwood money was not coming. The Upper Arlington sellers had been notified. They had another buyer. They were not extending the closing date. The deposit was forfeited. Forfeited. The word had a particular weight in the air between Ryan and Emily as he lowered his phone, blunt and final, like a door closing somewhere inside a house you can no longer enter. $45,000. Gone. Don't, she said. Emily, I said don't. She stood up from the front step, smoothed the front of her coat with both hands, a composing gesture, automatic and practiced. We need to call our attorney. And say what? She didn't answer that. Ryan called his mother. It rang 3 times. She answered. Mom. Ryan. Her voice was the same voice it had always been. Not cold, not triumphant. Just hers. You can't just... Mom, that was our house. It was my house, Ryan. A pause. It was my house because I sold my wedding ring and refinanced it twice and spent 30 years making sure it stayed standing. Those are the facts. We were trying to help you. You were trying to help yourselves. Not angry, just clear, the way she'd always been clear when she meant something. I understand why. I don't need you to be a villain for this to be what it is. But it is what it is. Silence. I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did, Margaret said. Not forgive me. Understand. Because understanding takes longer and it matters more. She hung up. Across town, she set her phone face down on the cafe table, picked up her novel, found her page. 3 days later, Margaret was in her new apartment, a studio in the short north 2nd floor, windows facing east, morning light that arrived early and stayed, when Tyler called from Denver. So, he said, how'd it go? It went, she said. She could hear him smiling through the phone. You good? I'm good, Tyler. A beat, then quieter. Mom, I should probably tell you something. She was sitting on the floor of her half-unpacked apartment, back against the wall, cup of tea beside her. I know you talked to O'Brien before I did, she said. Silence. I know you sent me that PDF last spring, she continued. The one about estate disputes in Ohio. I know you've been calling me every week for 3 years while making sure Ryan didn't know about it. And I know you had O'Brien's number ready because you'd already spoken to him yourself. How long have you known? He asked quietly. That you were watching out for me? Since about 2022. She picked up her tea. I'm a teacher, Tyler. I notice when someone's paying careful attention. Why didn't you say anything? Because you were doing what you needed to do in the way that made sense for you, she said. And I was doing the same. We just happened to be working on the same problem from different angles. He laughed. A real one, slightly surprised, the laugh she'd always loved from him because it arrived without warning. Mom, he said, you are genuinely something else. I know, she said. Your father told me that regularly. The money she sent him 2 weeks later, $50,000, wire transfer, no note attached, arrived on a Tuesday morning. Tyler called her when he saw it. She didn't pick up. She texted instead. For no reason except that I wanted to. Don't argue with me. He didn't argue. Mondays and Wednesdays, 10 a.m. Watercolor class on High Street. Her instructor, a 35-year-old named Jack Harrison with paint permanently under his fingernails and the patient energy of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that mistakes are part of the process, told the class on her 3rd week that she was the fastest progressing student he'd had in 2 years. She thanked him and went back to her roses. She was painting roses. She had a whole series planned. Friday, 6:30 a.m., yoga with Dot, who had moved to the short north 1 week after Margaret. I've been meaning to downsize anyway, don't make it weird. And who showed up to every class 8 minutes early, complained about it the entire time, and never once missed a Friday. Every morning, coffee at the corner place with a book in her journal, which she'd started keeping again for the first time since 1989. The entries were not dramatic. They were mostly observations. The quality of light on the building across the street, what she'd thought about during yoga, the things she wanted to paint next. The particular silence of her apartment at 6 a.m. that was different from the silence at Elmwood, and not worse, just different. A silence that was entirely hers. Sophie called every Sunday. They talked for an hour, sometimes longer. Once Sophie asked her, Grandma, do you hate Dad? Margaret considered the question seriously without rushing it. No, she said. I love your father. I love him the same way I always have. I just finally love myself at least as much. That's kind of healthy, actually. I've been in therapy for 2 months, Margaret said. It's expensive and completely worth it. Sophie laughed. Sophie. It sounded like Ryan's laugh from when Ryan was young, before ambition had settled over him like a second skin. Margaret held that sound for a moment after she hung up, put it away carefully, like a photograph you take out sometimes, not to mourn, but to remember what was real. Ryan never filed a lawsuit. O'Brien had predicted this calmly across his oak desk. When the other side has a competency video, a forged deed, a completed third-party cash sale, and documentation at every step, they don't file. Filing makes it public. Public makes it permanent. Ryan sent one email, long and circling, a paragraph of explanation for every action, the tone of a man who needed to be understood more than he needed to apologize. Margaret read it once, saved it to a folder she labeled Someday, not Never, because she was not in the business of closing doors permanently, only of controlling who held the key. She did not write back. Not yet. The money, $862,000 after fees and Tyler's share, became several things. It became a scholarship fund at Westbury Elementary in Thomas's name, the Thomas A. Sullivan Memorial Award for students of limited means and unlimited potential. The principal cried when Margaret brought her the paperwork. Margaret handed her a tissue and told her she was very welcome. It became a modest, well-managed investment portfolio. Conservative, sustainable, the kind that didn't make headlines but didn't disappear either. It became the deposit on the Short North apartment, the watercolor supplies, the yoga membership, the therapy, the cappuccinos ordered without apology. It became most importantly hers. On a Saturday in late autumn, the same November she'd flash-forwarded to in her memory that last morning on Elmwood Drive, Margaret took the bus back to Westerville and walked down the street she'd lived on for over 4 decades. She walked slowly, hands in the pockets of her red wool coat, breath visible in the cold air. 1147 Elmwood looked good. The Dunhams had already replaced the broken sidelight panel. There was a wreath on the front door, pine boughs and a red ribbon, a little early for the season, but cheerful. Through the front window she could see the warm glow of lamps, the edge of a different couch than the one she'd owned, and what might have been a child's drawing taped to the wall at a small person's height. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. A house needed people in it. That was the whole point of a house. It had needed her and Thomas, and then her alone, and now it needed the Dunhams. None of that was sad. All of it was right. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. She did not look back, because she was a woman who had learned, finally, at 72, which was maybe the exact right age to learn it, that forward is the only direction that truly belongs to you. Somewhere in Columbus, in a kitchen that is no longer hers, the red rose she left has long since dried. But Patricia Dunham found the small glass bud vase when they moved in and set it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink because she thought it looked like it belonged there. She was right. Some things know where they belong. So do some people. It just sometimes takes a locked door, a letter, and a very clear-eyed Tuesday morning in April to remind them. Is a mother's love unconditional, or should it have limits? If you think Margaret did the right thing, you know what to do. And if this story reminded you of someone, a mother, a grandmother, a woman who gave too much for too long, share it with her. She deserves to know she is not alone.